Drafted in a main event from the 109, the day that Cooper Kupp has a setback. That's what we're going to be doing today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, is our second main event. In our first main event, we took Jonathan Taylor at the 303.
Did we? I don't remember that.
I obviously not thrilled about that.
Yeah. Doesn't seem likely.
Seems like something we're just going to write off and pretend it didn't happen. And in this one, we're actually getting a little bit of a late start here for the YouTube listeners at the RotoViz YouTube channel, or the YouTube watchers. You can see the board. It's up there. As we're getting started, you're already getting a view of what we did in the first round, because we've already picked at 109. My big teaser a minute ago. We did take Amon-Ra St. Brown over Cooper Kupp. This is the first draft I'm seeing since the Cooper Kupp setback. I was interested to see where he might go. Shawn, only three receivers before us at 109. The start of the draft went Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson. McCaffrey won, interesting enough. Jamar Chase, 103. Bijan Robinson, 4. Austin Eckler, 5. Travis Kelce goes 106 in tight end premium. His ADP is at the number 2 spot. Tyreek Hill, and then Nick Chubb goes 108. And so we were on the clock with every receiver available. We did decide on Amon-Ra St. Brown. We had a quick conversation about it as we were getting set up a little bit late. We've never been one to be on time or two to be on time. We considered Garrett Wilson here, but we thought maybe we'd try to push him around the turn. So we take Amon-Ra St. Brown at 109. Lamb goes 110. Diggs goes 111. Kupp goes at 112. A Kupp Saquon Barkley team here at 112. He is off the board. It's not something we'll have to discuss at 204. So that's the start so far. We're 2 picks away from potentially getting our St. Brown, Garrett Wilson start. A.J. Brown is still on the board at this moment. But how are you doing?
Well, good and bad, I guess. I put out my deep league strategy piece today, talking about how you win the Fantasy Pros contest. And I mean, Ben, that contest at this point looks like it's going to have a little bit of overlay. FFPC is saying they think that you should enter because with $350, you've got a better chance than usual to win $1 million. But I'm starting to feel a little gun shy because Cooper Kupp was one of the recommendations there, as was Kendre Miller. I don't think I should publish anything else between now and the start of the season because I'm taking these guys out. There's some real strays being caught by, I don't know. So Garrett Wilson does go there.
It's been tough, Shawn.
I had a good feeling about this. I was telling you that, there needed to be something that balanced it out. We kind of wanted Garrett Wilson at the 109. I just felt like he was going to come back. He doesn't, though.
I did as well want him or feel like he was going to come back. I was leaning more towards Amon-Ra. I do still have Amon-Ra ranked 1 spot ahead of Garrett Wilson. But, man, when we did our 2024 first round, Shawn, both you and I had him as, I believe, our wide receiver 3 for next year behind. I think both of us did it that way, behind only Jefferson and Chase. And for me, that was a little bit – and A.J. Brown goes. We're on the clock. We'll talk about Wilson a little bit more in a moment. Jalen Waddle, the last sort of the exciting receivers this high for me at this point. And I'm getting really excited about him, honestly. Do you see an argument to go anywhere else? Mark Andrews is there. The best running backs probably are I guess the best running back is Tony Pollard at this point. I know that's not a way you want to play this. What are you thinking?
Can we just pass? I don't want to take any more of these guys out. I think that tactically, Mark Andrews is the pick. But, I want to pick
Jalen Waddle. Yeah, let's take Jalen Waddle. I don't disagree with you necessarily on Andrews, but I want to take Waddle too. So we're going to take who we want to take. I think, there's an argument from a tactical standpoint because of the things we've talked about for starting wide receiver, and then wanting to be flexible to hit some other positions. It is a little different in FFPC where, for those who don't know, we start 2 running backs, we start 2 receivers, 1 tight end, and then 2 flexes. You don't absolutely need a ton of wide receiver depth necessarily. So, could have been argued that we didn't need to get the 2 wide receivers in a format where we only have to start 2. And because of the tight end premium, that's a big part of why Mark Andrews would make a lot of sense there. He's still falling. 3 picks have come off after us. Derrick Henry, Devonta Adams, and Patrick Mahomes go. The Kelsey drafter is who took Mahomes at 207 and gets that stack. It is one of the most popular stacks in the early, or I guess we're not early anymore, but in the main event data that has been collected. Shout out to Fantasy Mojo, who does some work on that stuff and digs into the actual drafts. Sean, Garrett Wilson, we were talking about. We both had him as our wide receiver 3 behind only Jefferson and Chase. And when we did that exercise, I kind of started questioning whether I should. I mean, I have both Amon-Ra St. Brown and Wilson very aggressively ranked. But Wilson feels like the higher ceiling play. I think I'm playing a little bit of like floor, receptions floor with Amon-Ra and having him where I have him.
But you've made a really good argument that he is basically, I mean, this isn't fair. I mean, one of the reasons why I mentioned Cooper Kupp today is that, I mean, Kupp's 2021 was insane. And then last season, even as the peripherals declined and he went from 2.8 air yards per route to 2.3, his yards per target falls as a result, but he still scores a ton of points before he gets hurt. I mean, he's just this prototypical, crazy high floor, high ceiling player. Having said that, I think that your argument in favor of Amon-Ra as like basically a young version and this, I mean, if you're taking a guy in the first round, it's not much of an arbitrage play, but someone who could be the next guy and is on the rise. And certainly if Kupp is injured and his quarterback, maybe has some questions, I mean, maybe we essentially drafted the next Cooper Kupp. So I don't know that we're necessarily giving up a ton. I say that having, drafted Garrett Wilson yesterday with Blair Andrews. Blair joined us on RotoViz Overtime in a BBT for the FFPC. It was kind of the same deal where, just like we did with Jalen today, we had the 108. Cooper Kupp was there. This is before any news about it. We said, we're going to take Garrett Wilson, the guy we want. So we did.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love that. Ben, I just got done reading your cut down version of Stealing Signals. That was, a huge relief to me to be able to go through that and get all that information there. And one of the things that jumped out to me was that basically these 2 guys, and we really wanted to get them together here. I mean, both of these guys, legitimate threats to go, not just 30% target share, but maybe 31, 32, which again, I mean, that starts to give you crazy high floor and ceiling.
Right. That's where I was going to go with the Garrett Wilson conversation. Is this discussion that Randall Cobb's going to be the number 3? Obviously, Corey Davis retiring. Denzel Mims gets moved earlier in the offseason. For a bit, it seemed like the Jets were going to have a ton of guys. And then it was like, okay, well, Aaron Rodgers brought in his guys. How much are they actually going to play? And now it looks like Aaron Rodgers' guys are the only other ones that are going to play. It's going to be Alan Lazard and Randall Cobb, and Mecole Hardman apparently couldn't beat out Randall Cobb. And Sean, by the way, in this draft we are in now, Mark Andrews still on the board at the 303 right now. It's a pretty wild outcome. Tony Pollard, Devonta Smith, Josh Jacobs, Calvin Ridley, and Jalen Hurts was the rest of the second round after the Mahomes pick. Hawkinson goes 301. Olave has gone 302 to a draft that started with 3 straight receivers. It is, again, a shocking result here to see Mark Andrews falling this far.
Ben, are you plugged into the fantasy matrix?
He goes 303 finally. Wild.
Something I don't know happened to him in the last 45 minutes?
I know. That's what I'm trying to figure out as well. That was probably the latest that Mark Andrews has gone in one of these, I would have to guess. But the Garrett Wilson point is, if he's up for it, if he's good enough, if he's ready to break out. I mean, again, the tight ends, you still only have Conklin and CJ Uzama. I mean, we're not really talking about any competition here. If he's ready for a 30% target share, it now looks like after cutdown day, he's very much going to be in line for it. There's not a lot of competition there. The guys that are running routes alongside of him are very much ancillary receivers, not threats to him being the elite number 1. Similar case for Amon-Ra. When you talk about the guys that they are left with, all of them are vertical profiles. Amon-Ra basically the only underneath profile. Khalif Raymond sort of an Amon-Ra backup, but earlier in his career used to just be sort of a deep threat, had 17 plus ADOTs multiple seasons in his early career. Even the Lions' 7th round pick that they kept is a guy who in college 18 plus ADOT. I mean, deep guys, and even Jameson Williams when he comes back, a deep guy. So everything kind of set up for him and Laporta and Gibbs to be the main guys underneath. So both of those guys looking really great. But I think there's great news for Waddle as well, who's the guy we did end up taking. Shawn, we're now almost on the clock in the third. After Olave and Andrews at the beginning of the third, we get Jahmyr Gibbs, Josh Allen, T. Higgins, Joe Mixon, and Keenan Allen. We are up. The top running backs on the board, probably Ramondre Stevenson, Travis Etienne, Breece Hall is definitely there. T. Higgins did go. So receiver-wise, I guess we're probably looking at Debo as the top. And we are through the top 3 quarterbacks and the top 3 tight ends. What are you thinking here?
Well, I don't want to get through main event season without the two of us having Breece Hall together. I know you have him on some other teams. Is there another pick that we want first if we assume he's more likely to slide, or do we just grab him here?
I mean, it would be Ramondre Stevenson would be the only answer to that question for me. But I would be very comfortable just taking him here. Only one running back behind us. I don't really feel comfortable saying anyone's going to slide. But Breece would be the one that would. So we do go Ramondre. I think that was the right call. We'll get some more drafts in if we don't get him here, Shawn. I think we'll make sure to get Breece somewhere. But yeah, no. So Waddle was the other guy. I think you look at. I mean, one of the upside options for them to sort of have a third target share earner was it's Robbie Chosen. And I think for a while it was Chosen Anderson. Or people were thinking that was the name change. I think the last name was the name change. I think it's Robbie Chosen, if I'm not mistaken. That's definitely what he had on his jersey, Chosen, during the preseason. He gets released. So I, might not have to figure that out if he doesn't land anywhere else. Hopefully he does. We want everyone to succeed. But Cedric Wilson restructures his contract to stay in town. It looks like Braxton Berrios might be actually the third receiver. They lost Gesicki last year. And he actually had 5 touchdowns and was decent as a third weapon in their passing game. Everything was really concentrated on Hill and Waddle otherwise, but nothing has really materialized, whether that's Cedric Wilson or Berrios, that looks like it's going to be a threat to that. I don't even know who the top candidate would be to be the third main target earner there. And then you have all the running back issues with Jeff Wilson going on IR. A-Chain is banged up. Savon Ahmed is also banged up, apparently. It looks like Mostert and their young dude, I can't even remember his name, are going to be the only healthy running backs for week 1. Durham Smythe is your tight end. I mean, I think he's sort of vaguely interesting if he gets to run routes because somebody else has to catch balls right. Or do they is sort of the question. And Waddle is, to me, is just creeping back up higher and higher where it's these guys, Tyreek and Waddle might just get everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are some very minor profile issues with Waddle. And, I mean, it was crazy how dominant and dynamic Tyreek Hill was last year when you're talking about a guy who, 32% targets per route with Waddle only 23. And yet with that, Waddle was number 4 in the entire NFL in yards per route. And I'm telling you, he has got room to grow elements of that profile. Now, it's going to be hard, obviously, to sustain part of the yards per target element. But, I mean, you're talking about one of the youngest and fastest. I mean, he came in at the NFL a little bit older. He's not super, super young. But one of the fastest players in football in an offense that is designed perfectly for him, even though he can't catch. He put up those numbers last year despite the fact that he just does not play the ball well. I mean, imagine if he caught a couple of those extra passes.
Right.
Jalen Waddle was my 104 in our look ahead series. And so, I mean, I've been looking for situations to not take him. And that's one of the things we would have potentially had here is a situation where if we could have gotten Garrett Wilson, then that would be great. But yeah, I mean, Jalen Waddle has a very real chance to be the overall wide receiver 1. Love that. Ramondre Stevenson, I like here in round 3. I mean, he should be a 1-2 turn kind of pick. I like him ahead of, but I don't have him ranked ahead, but in part just to reflect the difference in ADP. And I want to make sure that, I'm not completely leading subscribers astray, but I think that he should probably go ahead of Saquon Barkley. I think he should go ahead of Nick Chubb. I mean, he might legitimately be like the next guy after Bijan and Austin Eckler are off the board. So I really enjoy this start that we're having here. I think it helps him that Pierre Strong was traded and now his competition is Ezekiel Elliott. So, I mean, I love this 3-pick start we've got going.
I do as well. We're 1 pick away from adding the guy that you almost wanted to take over the guy that you just described as a potential 1-2 turn pick. So we certainly like the other guy that we could potentially get here in the 4th. I'm a little nervous. I'm going to be honest. The guy at the 10 hole picking ahead of us is running the clock down. He started with 3 straight receivers, CeeDee Lamb, A.J. Brown, Deebo Samuel. Could be a running back pick. We're down to 5 seconds on the clock here. And the pick is DJ Moore. He starts with 4 straight receivers. So, Shawn, we aren't going to leave main event season without a Breece Hall share together, I don't think, right?
Excellent. And another note that you had in your just released piece, and I mean, I think people probably know this, or at least a lot of listeners know it, but it definitely seems like it has not taken hold in terms of ADP, is that Breece Hall is healthier than Dalvin Cook, right?
Yes.
Now, I mean, maybe in 2 weeks, there'll be a situation where Cook's concerns clear up because of what they are, and Breece is still in the middle of sort of a longer-term rehab. But, I mean, it sounds like Breece Hall is already back to being like the fastest running back in football. And you just also mentioned the situation there with the Jets where, I mean, he could end up being a massive part of the passing game. So I really like this here. And if there's any consolation to missing on Garrett Wilson, I've got lots of teams with those 2 guys together. I don't think it hurts us to have a team here that is not like both Jets.
Yeah, I agree with that. I kind of like, and that was part of the really tempting thing about taking Hall over Stevenson, is I was like, well, we didn't get Wilson on this team, so you can kind of understand wanting to really push Hall, but to get Stevenson and Hall together, I think was I mean, obviously once it works out, you're happy, but it was great to see that come together because certainly, when you're in these big tournaments, you want to try to get the best version of the build that you can. So yeah, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Ramondre Stevenson, Breece Hall. That's the start, Shawn. We talked on our recent podcast about this wide receiver start, and then being willing to address running back in the dead zone and go after this and build this way. We've drafted like this in the past, even with some of our main events. Longtime listeners that listen closely will know. The teams where we have gone a little bit running back heavy, we typically have like 1 each year. Including a Breece Hall team last year, if I'm not mistaken, like a Breece Hall, J.K. Dobbins team where we went running backs in maybe the 4th, 5th. Those teams have tended to not do very well because it's just frankly not a very great strategy, but it is one that this year presents some different dynamics and some really intriguing dynamics, and we are willing to lean into a little bit. After our Hall pick, Najee Harris and Kenneth Walker go with the next 2 picks, and then Christian Watson and Deontay Johnson. We're still a ways away, but what are you thinking as we start to look ahead to the 5-6 turn? Now that we've locked in the wide receiver start, and we got 2 really good 1-2 running backs, do you start to consider an elite quarterback or elite tight end option at 5-6? Do you start to consider, certainly other receivers are going to be in consideration quickly for us. Where does your head go next?
One of the things that we have here with this start that I do like is that flexibility, or not even necessarily flexibility, but the strong possibility of guys like Tua and Jared Goff being fits for the team, and also being in that price range where we can build a ton of other firepower into it before we have to go to them. And so probably it wouldn't be elite QB, although I have to say that in a redraft environment, with a little bit of a lesser emphasis when we're thinking about the 3-week race, a lesser emphasis on trying to get, all these game stacks involved, but just the high scorer at Justin Fields is pretty appealing to me. I think he has a chance to be the overall QB1 In our previous draft, we were able to get Kyle Pitts in the 5th. I don't know, how much Pitts we want, but his ADP is close to getting back to us. I mean, he's such an upside play that does still interest me. Also, Dallas Goedert, somebody who goes late in the 5th round, I think is just sort of the stealth play. I just think it's an undervalued type of move. We had an article from Ming Song today talking about AJ Brown and this possibility of the Eagles passing a lot more. I think you and I on the show have discussed how, there are some elements to that, but also some things where, if that came into play, you might have concerns about other things that were happening. And yet one of the guys, I think, an easier way to play that, or a cheaper way to play it, where it still hits something that's very high leverage for your team, which is a tight end and tight end premium. I think that if you get Dallas Goedert in 5 or even coming back in 6, as opposed to having to pay the prices for AJ Brown or Devontae Smith, that part also interests me. So those are kind of some of the things I'm thinking about here as we have about 8-9 picks to go to us.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And one of the big advantages, you use that word flexibility. I mean, that's one of the big advantages that we have discussed about this start is when you get into this 5th round, you have a lot of options. You have a lot of ways you can go. And then the draft itself has value pockets and positional, arguments for basically being willing to hit on at all positions. Even as you said, you didn't necessarily want to reach for a QB. There's arguments for taking like a Fields. It is very nice to have this little stable wide receiver, running back start. Got some boxes checked off, kind of focused more on your starting lineup. We've talked about this. It's a more comfortable way to draft. We've always talked about 0RB as a strategy that when you go really receiver heavy like that, you have to be willing to be a little bit uncomfortable. In a draft like this, there is more comfort. You do feel like you can go a lot of different directions, and this is a year where a lot of options could be there. Shawn, one guy that I'm looking at is we're now 5 picks away is Brandon Ayuk has still not gone here at the 503. We're at the 504 now through the 503. If you really are interested in Fields, I'll note the guy behind us who took DJ Moore at 403. That was an aggressive pick. Has taken 4 straight receivers. Would not surprise me. Certainly is not afraid to go away from running back. Would not surprise me if they did want to get Fields to stack with Moore. So if you wanted Fields, I would probably say that we would want to talk about that at 509 as opposed to 604. I don't know that we would get him past the DJ Moore drafter, especially the 403 DJ Moore drafter twice. Jahan Dotson and Brandon Ayuk go back-to-back at 504 and 505. That's a really lofty price on Dotson, but not loftier than where you and I both have him ranked. He would have been my next guy right after Ayuk.
And he and Dotson, they're going in the last 3 days, just the last 3 days, going at 602 and 609. So it is above the current market prices.
Right. But we're going to tip our hat to that because we're certainly not going to, think that was wrong of them. But yeah, definitely guys that we would have expected to have. Certainly Dotson, I would have expected to have in consideration at the 5-6 turn. But we don't have to go receiver here, which we've talked about. And the position that is getting pushed down, Dameon Pierce now goes, is tight end. A lot of times at the 5-6 turn, you don't even get an option of any of these tight ends. They all go. Justin Herbert goes as well. We still have Pitts, Kittle, and Goddard on the board, 1 pick away. One of the guys behind us already has Darren Waller. We might be able to push tight end around and potentially get Goddard at 604. I'm not really seeing clear reasons to do that outside of potentially maybe Javonte Williams and James Cook if you wanted to go with a third running back, or Fields.
How are you feeling about
Pickens? Yeah.
George Kittle's health right now.
Oh, George Kittle. I thought you were going to say George Pickens. I don't know. I actually don't. That's a blind spot for me. Do we have concerns about his health?
I think so, but he goes there at the 508, so that's not anything that we have to discuss now. So we have Pitts. That's a pretty fun one. I mean, I like James Cook right here. I like Javonte Williams right here.
Who do you like more of those two?
I don't know. It might even be a situation where I think that James Cook has an easier way to get the whole thing done. But I mean, Javonte Williams is just such a massive talent. Who do you prefer?
I have Williams ranked one spot ahead of him, but I had Cook ahead of him at one point, and I flipped him. That's why I asked. I'm as indifferent as you. Do you think it's a running back pick here as we're down to 10 seconds, or do you think we should just lock in a tight end?
Let's lock in
running back.
Okay. Let's lock in Pitts and see who comes back.
We're going to take Pitts there. So once Kittle went, it did complicate things a little, because also in the tight end premium with the 2 flexes, you do see guys who understand the value of tight end who take a Waller early, sometimes hit a second tight end. And I'm not sure that Pitts and Goddard would have made it back. In fact, I don't believe they probably would have passed 6 more picks. This is behind their ADP. As you mentioned, they both tend to go a little bit higher in the 5th round. Fields does go 1 pick behind us to the DJ Moore drafter.
That's interesting. I thought that he was going to pass on that after having taken 4 wide receivers to start. That's an aggressive play. You were all over the possibility he would do that. I love Fields. I don't necessarily know that I need him with DJ Moore. They've got a lot of other ways for him to win there. But that's a fun team. CeeDee Lamb, A.J. Brown, Deebo Samuel, DJ Moore, Justin Fields. I mean, I like those 4 receivers, and then you get that elite QB with it. That's a fun one.
You're saying there's a lot of other ways for him to win. When you meant him, you meant Fields, correct?
Right.
Do you like more? I see. So the reason I was calling that is I think if you take more this aggressively, you're pretty in on the Bears, and Fields is the better way to play it anyway. So if you're that in on DJ Moore, then I think you kind of have to take Fields, because I think it's really hard for DJ Moore to pay off 403 without Justin Fields paying off 510 and then some. I think Fields is going to be the bigger hit at 510 than Moore will be at 403 in basically any situation. But that doesn't mean everybody thinks that way necessarily. So I do hear your point, but I was curious if you were saying that DJ Moore had other ways to win, but it does not sound like that was what you were saying. We have not seen a running back go. Terry McLaurin goes right after Fields.
So then we're 4 picks away here. Oh, Javonte does go. One thing I want to ask you here, if we get Pickens as a possibility, would you still be good with James Cook? Because one of the things that I'm seeing is just when we think through, I mean, there's a risk to play this way, but there's also the upside where in round 7, you've got a great chance of getting either Jerry Jeudy or JSN. In round 8, you can take Quentin Johnston. In round 9, you got a great chance to get Treylon Burks, and if not, you can take Rashad Bateman. In round 10, you can take Rashad Bateman. And it's a very weird dynamic where wide receivers have been pushed up, and yet the profiles you want are actually still available very freely in rounds where they probably shouldn't be.
We agree with all that. We are back waiting for the guy at the 10 to not take our running back. He did not take Breece Hall last time. He has still not taken any running back. After McLaurin, Javonte Williams and Rachaad White went to the turn drafter. Dallas Goedert does go on the way back. He takes a running back, but it's not James Cook. He takes Alexander Mattison. I saw the green and got a little bit nervous. I really like George Pickens, Sean, but you were asking that question. I'm right there with you. I think we can take Cook here comfortably. I like Pickens a lot. It's not easy to let him go. Other names that are available include Godwin and JSN. I actually still have JSN ranked 1 spot ahead of Pickens, and we can potentially get JSN at 709. That's part of why Cook, I think, is the pick here, as you just detailed.
Excellent. That's a lot of fun. I've said that several times throughout the draft at this point, but it was a refrain the other night, and it became a lot less fun. Ben, I tend to be pretty optimistic and bounce back relatively quickly from things. When I woke up the next morning after Jonathan Taylor was put or remained on PUP, I was furious, just raging for that first hour and a half or so. And then I did the best ball banana stand with Pete.
I can't even imagine what you furious was. Were you just like, did you like lightly kick your garbage can?
I was I was angry. It's so funny that I do have a couple of old time tennis teammates, and it was funny because between when I played in college and when I coached in college, I was able to kind of make this transition to being calmer and collected and those types of things. But certainly some of my old tennis teammates would think it's absolutely hilarious that I have the calm.
This idea is a calm.
It's like, who threw more rackets over the fence or broke more equipment in college than Shawn? The answer would be nobody. Nobody's even close.
Well, we do know you're competitive. I mean, that's one of the driving factors in all of this for all of us who like to analyze these things, play these games. There's certainly competitiveness. So anyway, that's not surprising in your younger years.
So yeah, I was frustrated. It went from being one of the most fun drafts we've ever had to a draft that now has a hole in it. And yet, as long as this whole deal, I mean, one of the things too, Ben, is you start to get really concerned. I've seen Jonathan Taylor go as early as basically almost unchanged in not just one or two, but like several underdog drafts that I've done. I've also seen him fall to 6 or 7, which makes a lot more sense, especially in best ball, where, I mean, you're just going to simply not get those points. I think that in redraft, like even on our team here, if we had decided to take Jonathan Taylor and just say, look, we can build out a good enough starting lineup, and eventually he's going to play. And when he does, he's going to give us massive points, which is sort of how, now that I've had time to, really process it, is how I'm looking at the draft that we already did. Now, we paid more than, we would have liked to have done, but I still really like that team.
Mm.
You have a situation here where, again, you could draft him, but I mean, this looks like one where he could miss the entire season.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one now, and I've moved him well down my rankings. I moved him down that first day. Well, first, Shawn, I was so frustrated, like you described yourself, being that I was like, I know I need to do my rankings for the subs. I know there's subscribers that have drafts tonight, but I was just like, I can't do it. I'm gonna go turn on a TV show. I was like, I'm gonna go be annoyed for an hour. And Jonathan Taylor goes off the board here at 6'11". Jackson Smith and Jigba did go off at 6'09". A bummer to see. George Pickens still actually out there. Probably not going to make it back to us. But this early part of the draft continues to push players that you typically see go. We talked about Mark Andrews swinging all the way around, going 303. No one worrying about him in the back half of the second round. Here we get the back half of the sixth round. We're getting guys, taking stabs at places and whatnot. Anyway, I did eventually go and decide I needed to sit down and think about it and move Taylor down. And I did. And then when I woke up the next morning with a clear head, I dove back into it as well because I wanted to make sure, I trusted those ranks. And I had to move him down further. Initially, I moved him down into like the Miles Sanders territory of my rankings. I ended up moving him down beyond the Washington backs into like Samaje Perine territory, because I do think what you said is true. Like, we have the potential for this to be something that lingers all year. We have evidence already that the Colts are willing to push this and take on risk in some of those things. We don't really know what their offers were, and we don't know what Jonathan Taylor's asking prices were, but certainly leaving him on PUP was an aggressive decision in terms of that can backfire. There can be ways that doesn't actually work out favorably for you. Jerry Jeudy and Pickens go on the way back here, Shawn. We've been excited about the potential for what we could do at receiver later after this type of start, but this draft room is on our guys, so it's a little bit trickier. The best receivers right now on my board, which almost never happens, are Tyler Lockett and Mike Evans. Those guys are a little bit further down my board. I'm not completely fading them, but typically they go before sometimes Evans shows up as my top available, but right behind them, Quentin Johnston, Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, Treylon Burks on my board. Definitely some options we can move to in that range, but we are, and I'm not even saying I want to take Lockett and Evans. That was just sort of for argument's sake. We are getting down to a lot of receivers coming off the board. Sky Moore goes here at 704. Shawn, feeling like 2023 a little bit with that Sky Moore pick, or 2022, I should say. Tyler Lockett does go as well. But yeah, Taylor, I think a really tough pick, and I'm with you. And then the tough thing is you talk about our team. We took him at 303, and then you know that there's going to be a whole bunch of teams now drafted with him at 611 like this team. So even if it works out for you, you are behind the 8 ball when being compared directly against teams that are drafting him several rounds later. That's one of the, it doesn't mean those teams are immediately dead, but it is one of the really tough realities that even if he comes back after 4 games, even if he gets drafted, even if he's a great player for the rest of the year, you're still kind of in a tough spot.
This is going to sound overconfident, and I don't really mean it exactly that way, but I guess I still have a belief that the team we drafted is got a chance to make it, where I think even most of the Taylor teams who take him later are going to be dead. So I guess that part of it maybe even doesn't worry me as much. I just wanted to play. Yeah. So then what about, this was kind of the thing that I have been floating this year. What about taking another running back here? DeAndre Swift seems like easily the best player.
There's a pretty important list that weighs heavily into my process every year where he's very prominently ranked. So I would like to get him. Yes. So we take, I don't know if I'm allowed to tease how far I'm allowed to tease it, but
go all the way.
The number 1 player on the 0 RB countdown, DeAndre Swift, our 4th running back in 5 rounds. Mike Evans did go. A bunch of picks went off there as we were closing up that Jonathan Taylor conversation. But after Lockett, Pat Frymuth, Mike Evans, Trevor Lawrence were the 3 picks back to back to back. Mike Evans was I'm so zoomed in for the YouTube viewers that I can't even see it. The wide receiver 36 at the 707. I guess I'm not really sure if that's particularly high or low. It seems like that's early. You also had Jordan Addison in the queue, but you and I both don't really have him as the top of the available rookies. It kind of would have been the pick so that we could have then tried to still stack like a Quentin Johnson and a Zay Flowers and a Treylon Burks and a Rashad Bateman the next several rounds. And we might have a hard time doing that now, but I think leaning into the Swift, leaning into what the room is giving you, we do have the anchors with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Waddle. One of the things about those two that we do feel confident in is they're going to have a lot of volume. Again, you've talked a lot about this with Miami where I know you've referenced the stealing signals tool several times. The weighted targets per out run, the targets per out run for Hill and for Waddle, both among the top 15 or so in the NFL last year, going to be very concentrated in Miami. And then obviously Amon-Ra right up there at the very top. These guys are going to earn plenty of volume. They're going to stabilize our wide receiver room. We now have 4 running backs. We might have to flex 2 of them, right? We talked about that at the top. This is a 2 receiver, 2 running back, 2 flex scenario. We still want to get our receiver depth, but the room is giving us this. We're taking what the room is giving us, and then we're hoping that as the room has given us this, they've taken a lot of receivers so far, they start to go away from receiver, and we're able to stack some bets. That's not a guarantee. There are a lot of drafters out there that like to think like us and keep taking those receivers until the wide receiver window closes. That might be what happens the rest of the way here as the guy on the turn auto-selects Jordan Addison on a timeout, and Cortland Sutton, 2 receivers come off the board with the little asterisk next to him on a timeout. That's unfortunate. But Dalvin Cook and Miles Sanders went after our Swift picks. We're kind of hoping that more running backs might start to come off the board. Maybe some tight ends or maybe some quarterbacks. I don't know. But we at 804 are very likely to take a receiver now, Sean. And then on the way back, we're hoping at 9 and 10 that we can hit a little bit of a wide receiver home run. But you got to take what the draft gives you and give yourself a chance to really knock your draft out of the park. I mean, Ramondre Stevenson, Breece Hall, James Cook, and DeAndre Swift, while also having Kyle Pitts, while also having the Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jalen Waddle start. There's a lot of good football players on our team right now, and that's ultimately the goal.
And DeAndre Swift there, I think there's a lot of great evidence, and even just anybody watching the game on Sundays, I think would potentially also agree that he's the best pre-contact runner in football, and it's going to be a great fit for that Philadelphia offense. The home runs that he could potentially hit this year, I don't know. It starts to get the juices really flowing just thinking about that. So what I wanted to ask you here, or what I was going to ask you before Addison was auto-picked, and I don't see The thing that was tough there is that if you auto pick, you go on auto draft, and for the drafter at the turn, you can get stuck with that second pick as well, which may have happened to him with Cortland Sutton. But I guess that's beside the point here. So we're up, and I don't think in a room where JSN went early that Treylon will come back to us since he is back at practice and doing well. I think that we probably need to snap him up here.
You would take him over Quentin Johnston and Zay Flowers and some of those guys straight up?
I would. And I think that Quentin Johnston has a much better chance of coming back.
Okay. Let's take Treylon. I agree with the take our top guy here. I like
just
that
to give a little bit more context, that over just the last couple of days, Quentin Johnston, wide receiver 46 at the 907 or the 908, Treylon Burks one spot behind. And so with them that close, and with Treylon, I think the guy who's rising right now, we want to kind of flip how we're looking at taking them. They're going right next to each other in round 9.
But both of them had a shot to come back, right? Somebody like a Zay Flowers, I think, no real chance to come back. And
kind of the thing I was thinking there is that Bateman, not that he would be our preferred guy straight up, but if we're trying to get a Ravens receiver, he's probably our shot in 10.
Got it. That does make sense. We do have some cover. So as we're talking through this, I mean, at the top of the queue, Marquise Brown, Gabe Davis, Michael Pittman are all available. Those don't entice you. Most of them don't entice me. I might have went Gabe Davis or been willing to discuss going Gabe Davis, I guess. I don't think I would have ultimately done that. And I do like your point on Bateman vis-a-vis Flowers. Flowers does go here. The 4 picks since we went are Cooks, Charbonnet, Evan Ingram, and Zay Flowers. Pittman goes behind him. So some of that cover is getting taken away. And Khalil Herbert, these picks are coming off fast, which is always nice to see. We are hoping that Quentin Johnston or one of these other receivers does make it back. There goes Gabe Davis as well. Marquise Brown's still there at the top of the queue. Would expect him to go pretty quickly as well. Michael Thomas right behind him. And then Elijah Moore, Quentin Johnston. And then Bateman buried a few names further beyond that. That, to me, would be the rest of this tier. Hoping that we get at least one of those back to us, certainly. But I think you're right. I mean, we see these guys that have gone very receiver heavy. The Jackson Smith and Jigba drafter already had 5 receivers, had already taken Sky Moore at 704, did take Pittman as his 6th here in the 8th, has taken 6 through 8. Another drafter that just took Gabe Davis, that was his 5th through 8. I think you're right that when you get in these rooms where you're not seeing the receivers fall, you can't just hope that they're going to. Michael Thomas goes at the turn here, and this continues to be a receiver-heavy room, which is fine. That's sort of how we expect things to go, frankly, coming from, or what we would say is probably more efficient, and then certainly coming from the Underdog streets and some of the best ball stuff. Kadarius Toney goes right behind Michael Thomas. So we're getting a lot of receivers. That cover is getting blown. Elijah Moore does come off.
One of your notes today was that you moved Rashee Rice down a little bit. I'm still very high there, but I certainly understand why you would do that. Does that have a corresponding pull where Kadarius Toney creeps up a tad bit, or he remains unaffected?
I didn't move Toney up in the ranks, but I did write a piece yesterday of the biggest things that I might get wrong and try to talk through some of the things that are concerning to me. And Toney was one that, I mean, it's certainly one that I could look back on at mid-season and be like, well, missed that. Because he's a very talented player, very athletic, shown a ton of yak ability, shown some target earning ability, a lot of reasons to like him. Can't stay on the field. The reason I don't want to move him up is I just don't feel like they're ever going to get comfortable enough to play him a full snap share. So, like, one of my points was if he gets to 70 or 80% routes at some point, it's probably going to feel like a miss. Just, for that stretch at least, assuming he stays healthy and plays at that rate. But I kind of feel like when they talk about the packages and the rotations, when they keep 7 receivers, when they did that last year, And the only guys they're really talking about as potential full-time guys are Sky and MVS. They're already part of the reason I moved Rice down is you had Brett Veach openly saying, the GM, that we're going to think of him as a package player early in the year. Same with Justin Ross. And I think Ross is a great example of another guy like Tony, where this guy has health issues, and I don't think you're probably going to see a ton of 80% route shares from Justin Ross, even if he breaks out. Because I think the way that the Chiefs are seeing it is we want to keep these guys healthy. We want to rotate them. They're also thinking 3 games into the playoffs, right? We want them to make these decisions to make these guys full-timers by week 17. They might do it in the AFC Championship game if they really think that's their best chance to win. But week 17 for the Chiefs in some ways is a warm-up, right? So it does become a little bit tricky. And I think there might be a little bit more rotating there than we want in fantasy football land. Since we saw Elijah Moore go, Sean, 5 picks, only 1 receiver. It was Romeo Doubs, who we do like, but not one of the main guys we're aiming for. Jalen Warren, Dalton Kincaid, A.J. Dillon, Dobbs, and Tyler Higbee were the 5 picks. We are on deck. Quentin Johnston, Bateman. Mims was the guy we were talking about alongside Rashee Rice, and I think there's a gap now. Mims you have to continue to hold in very high esteem right now, based on everything. But they claimed Philip Dorsett to get back to 5 receivers. The only receivers they had were Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, who I think you have to be optimistic about his health as well, given the fact that they cut all their other receivers, and Mims, who you have to be optimistic they're going to lean into. And then Brandon Johnson and Philip Dorsett now are the only other receivers they have on the roster. They're going to do some 2 tight end stuff as well. But Mims, I think, going to get plenty of run early in his rookie year. So he's one that's very exciting as well. Juju Smith-Schuster goes, Sean. Quentin Johnston. Marquise Brown still on the board. Not our favorite option, but, I mean, that's crazy. It's way past ADP. If we didn't have other good options, I would maybe want to do it. But do you like Quentin here?
I do. I was really holding my breath because now I think some of the other earlier decisions look really good.
Yeah, Quentin, you called the shot that he was going to come back here, and that was why you wanted to take Burks. You wanted to get both of them, and we did. So take your bow. That was very nice.
So just to go on Dobbs there, I mean, one of the things with Dobbs is also hurt. And that's a huge bummer because we have a lot of Dobbs, but it sounds like he might not be ready for week 1. And so that makes him a tough pick in this range. We did select him sort of deep into the going deep draft that Mike Clay runs every year. And so we still have a lot of confidence in him, but it's disconcerting without question that they won't answer whether or not, he's in good shape for the first week of the season. And then your notes there on Mims, I'm looking at that and I'm like, I mean, maybe there are some other things that'll happen here. Maybe they come out with just like 25% all tight end packages, but on legitimate passing plays in week 1, I mean, Marvin Mims looks like he's set up to play the entire game.
Right. Yeah. I mean, unless Jerry Judy's just a full go in week 1, what else are they going to do? Again, they have 5 receivers on the roster, including Judy. And Philip Dorsett, who they just claimed, and Brandon Johnson, who's more of a, I mean, was he even in camp with them, or did they claim him as well? Did they get down? Were they one of the teams that got down to 3 receivers for a while? They've had Brandon Johnson for a while, if I'm not mistaken. But, yeah, a surprising, Brandon Johnson's a UDFA from 2022 that they have had on the roster this offseason. Mims, and they're at a point now where they're looking at Mims, Judy, Sutton, and Brandon Johnson. Did they cut Philip Dorsett again? Okay, he's on their practice squad now. Earlier today when I wrote my look, they had him on the active roster. I'm not entirely sure. They might only have 4 active receivers. And again, one of them is Jerry Jeudy, who the whole fantasy community is playing like he's not going to play for 3 weeks. And I am concerned about Jerry Judy's hamstring, but good for him to avoid IR. But yeah, the way you put it, like Marvin Mims is going to play every down week 1.
So now that we've gone through that, his ADP is 1102. I mean, are we in the situation where you would like him better just straight up than Rashad Bateman?
That's where it gets tricky. And as we're talking through that, Marquise Brown did go. And then 3 running backs and Deshaun Watson go. Antonio Gibson, Raheem Mostert, Samaje Perine all around the turn. This guy in front of us takes Tank Bigsby, so we do have to make that choice. Probably still Bateman, but I don't know.
I mean, the other pick here too is Sam Laporta. We're somewhat leaning into the Lions. We talked on the previous show about the flexibility you get from that first Thursday night game by having Lions and Chiefs. I've got 3 players I really like here. I sort of want all of them. Mims is the most likely to make it back, I would think.
Yeah. That's why I would want to push him. Laporta's intriguing. I like pairing Pitts with another good upside option. But we do only have the 4 receivers. And I kind of think not taking, like getting Bateman to fall to us in 10, that's what we were kind of laying out when we took Burks, that we might have the shot at that. I kind of feel like that would be looking a gift horse in the mouth a little bit. As I was saying that, you did click Bateman. I think that's right. Laporta goes 1 pick behind it. That's always a little bit of like, oh, man, maybe we should just take a Laporta. He was very clearly the tight end pick. Dalton Kincaid and Higbee had both gone in the 9th before we took Quentin Johnston. Evan Ingram and Njoku were off the board in the 8th. Pat Fryermuth in the 7th. When you get into that range, Laporta's the play. He's the play over Higbee. He's arguably the play over Kincaid. Are you regretting that now that we've clicked the button and we've had a few seconds?
Well, one of the things that does happen if you pass on the receiver is that there's an extra receiver in the pool to push back through to right. You. I mean, that's one of the things, though, that I like about taking that Kyle Pitts shot there is that, I mean, we need that to work. We talk about both drafting like you're right and drafting like you're wrong, and you really want to combine the best elements of both of those two things. By taking Pitts, we are in a bet on Pitts. I think that in the tight end premium, you can kind of get overboard in thinking you're going to start a lot of those guys when really having multiple tight ends in your lineup is more of an FFPC best ball thing. Now, that's not to say that if you ended up with 2 stars, you couldn't play it, because you definitely can. But I don't think that we want to build the lineup around that. And certainly if we get into a situation where we have both running back and wide receiver built out, if we're in a position here at the end of the draft where we've taken these 4 running backs and yet we still like our wide receivers, then as we move through the season, we've got a lot we can do. And so we would be able to do both of those things, but also have Kyle Pitts. And so,
that's where I was at with it. I think you put that really well, and particularly with the Kyle Pitts bet and getting ahead of ourselves with the tight end and the flex, because with the 4 running backs, I mean, we're already, and then we're trying to get receiver depth as well. Like, we're already well into our I mean, assuming things pan out well for this team, we already had 4 running backs and 4 receivers, and we can only start 6 of those players total. So Laporta, just based on draft spot, obviously you want redundancy, but would have been, in some respects, our 3rd flex-eligible bench player. Now, that's not the right way to think of it, but it is sort of one way of framing it when you think about having the 4 running backs. And so, I mean, Bateman is too, the same thing, but we're fixing, chasing the receiver depth, fixing the lack of receiver depth early in the build. And as you just put it, the ability to have the 4 running backs and still have Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Treylon Burks, Quentin Johnston, and Rashad Bateman as your 5 receivers is a very fun way to build. That's what we kind of set out to do. What we think is kind of silly in 2023. That's a 5 receiver build that should probably take you a 7-round start to do with 2 detours. And instead, we're able to do that with 4 legit running backs in Stevenson, Hall, Cook, and Swift, and Kyle Pitts, as you noted. We also went out of our way to get a onesie in there. It's a very fun team. It's a very fun team so far.
It is. The only disappointing thing that's happened, this has been a run of players who are not really on our board. Now, Jerick McKinnon, I think, you also mentioned, I keep reflecting on these great nuggets that you had in your piece. I thought it was interesting. You said people should move Clyde Edwards-Helaire up. I'm putting Jerick McKinnon into the 0 RB update because that Chiefs running back situation is so bad. You mentioned that people have to think about CEH. I just don't think he can play at all, which is not disagreeing with what you're saying either. But then we have Adam Thielen, Anthony Richardson, Nico Collins, Daniel Jones, Elijah Mitchell, Dalton Schultz, Juwan Johnson. That group, I mean, the quarterbacks are kind of interesting. Elijah Mitchell is kind of interesting. A bunch of names we don't care about, but Marvin Mims does go 1103.
Yeah, bummer to see Mims go. Sean, I don't want to take CEH in your league, but he looks like they have 3 active running backs, and he's a guy that has been there and knows the offense, and he fell into 6 touchdowns early last year when they were playing him. Like, this is a guy that, he's going in like the 18th round. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. He's a potential Chiefs running back. Pacheco's not healthy.
LaMichael P. Ryan.
LaMichael P. Ryan is the answer.
Keep that name. With the Kansas City Chiefs, you actually want to look at their practice squad. You're like, well, their guys on their actual roster can't play. Check their practice squad.
So Rashee Rice goes as well. I do feel confident, Sean, with all these names that have, not even a ton have gone off, but I do feel confident that, it wasn't, you said if we sent Bateman, it might have pushed Mims back, but seeing both Mims and Rice go, I kind of feel like Bateman probably wouldn't have helped push back Mims enough, if that makes any sense. Maybe it would have. But yeah, the only other really intriguing receiver at this point to me is our buddy Pete Overton has made a good case to me about Jonathan Mingo. Legit shot to be the number 1. I think Bryce Young has looked good in the preseason. The intriguing receivers in that Carolina offense, we talked about Terrace Marshall, Laviska Shenault, both picked up August injuries. It looks like Mingo's going to play a lot from week 1. We don't actually really like Mingo's profile a lot, but the competition is weak. He could be an interesting option. What else are you thinking here? Is it tight end? I think big drop off from Laporta.
Yeah, sorry. We've pushed Tua, and he has made it back to us.
Yeah.
The other 3 teams to this side of the board do have QBs, but especially the Watson drafter, I think a real threat to double dip there and kind of play those guys together. I had a fun show with JJ the other day, and then he shared with me one of his main events where he went Watson to trying to accomplish something we had kind of talked about on the show. So I think we could still lose him there. I like Jameson Williams, Devin Achane, and Tyjae Spears here. I think that whoever comes back will probably be fine with.
Okay, let's do it that way then. I was going to bring up Williams. I had not looked at the running backs deep enough, but yeah, I think Tua. I think you're right. One of those 3. Those are all intriguing names. I was going to say, I know you really like Williams, and he would have been an interesting wide receiver 6 in this build for sure. So hopefully he comes back. But also, Achane's a really interesting pick at this stage of, we just found out today that Jeff Wilson will start the season on IR. Ezekiel Elliott was the last running back taken. Certainly we're in Devin Achane range, even though he is a little bit banged up. And I agree with you. Tyjae Spears a really nice pick at this point as well.
So the Wilson news really shocked me as well, because my understanding from reading about the Dolphins' practices was that after he had gotten hurt, he didn't play in the preseason game, and for a while it was listed as undisclosed. But it sounded like the people who were there, at the practices and whatnot, that it had been a hand injury and that he had actually continued practicing. So that was one of the reasons why I hadn't really pushed Mostert up and really hadn't pushed Wilson down, which was what was happening by ADP. But now the Dolphins, the release the Dolphins had with that today too wasn't even just we've got roster considerations that we have to deal with, so we had to do it that way. There was this almost cryptic comment that was like, oh, we wouldn't be surprised if he played this year, which, that also implies that it's very possible he won't play this year, which I didn't think was even on the table. And so, Achane, pretty exciting. He's also hurt, right? And you can understand why they were trying to go after Jonathan Taylor, which seemed mystifying. Other than Jonathan Taylor is awesome, and every other team in the NFL should be going after him, right? It's humorous that a Dolphins team that has spent so much on him or on their running backs in terms of re-signing those 2 guys and drafting Achane, and then you find out the other mystery team is the Packers.
Which I gotta feel like they were.
Dillon.
They must have been talking about sending Dillon back. That's the only way that makes sense to me. But Achane does go 1 pick ahead of us here, Sean. We have Tyjae Spears available. I think with our 4 early running backs, I like Tyjae Spears. You've gotten me really onto him. But I think Jameson Williams is a really intriguing wide receiver 6 on this build. We don't really need to play him early. The flex, like we talked about, could be covered, but he could come and provide. If your thesis is on him is right, and I've been pretty out on him, but if it's right, I think he's a really nice addition to this build. Do you like him or do you prefer Spears here?
I think I would like to stash a receiver with this much upside. Will that work?
Yes.
So this is one of the things too, where I do want to differentiate between redraft and best ball here as we're constructing the rosters, which is that, yeah, I mean, he's going to be a lost roster spot for a long time. And this is only a 12-week regular season. You've got to keep that in mind as you're putting the team together. And yet, when we're talking about the difference between how you're going to manage a starting lineup, where the guys you put in are going to be the ones that matter. Now, we tend to be always overly enthusiastic about who's going to stay healthy, how many points they're going to score, all of those types of things. But if we get to the point here where, like, the next guy who goes right after us is Allen Lazard. If we get to a point in this
we took
roster,
Williams at wide receiver 58. I have him as a fade at wide receiver 51. So several receivers behind where I have him ranked as a fade have already gone.
I mean, if you are putting Allen Lazard in your roster into your starting lineup before Jameson Williams is eligible to come back from suspension, then, I mean, your roster has issues. It's not in the mix, right? So, yeah. I mean, as our wide receiver 6, and we're trying to figure out how do we get the upside to win the whole tournament, specifically when we took 4 early running backs. And so on a lot of squads, it wouldn't make sense, right? If this is a 0 RB build, you're going to be like dead set. This is a lock Tyjae Spears pick. I think in this one, it was almost a lock the other direction.
Yeah, I think this was a really nice spot to get. Like, I'm really excited. I to be clear, I mean, I have him ranked wide receiver 51 and he's a fade. I was looking it up. He actually is going wide receiver 58. So it's kind of weird that I have him as a fade at 51, but that's in part because a lot of the other receivers just don't belong ranked any higher. You know, the other guys that have gone are Adam Thielen is a bigger fade, I guess, than Jameson Williams. He went 2 rounds ahead of where we took Williams.
Well, we had Rondell Moore go also, and I love Rondell Moore. The reason that we passed on Marquise Brown, we didn't talk about this, we probably should have. Once Colt McCoy was released, I think you have to assume this offense is going to not convert many third downs. They're not going to score many points. They're not going to complete many passes. And it really hurts everybody. Now, yeah. I mean, those young guys could do some dynamic things. It probably makes more sense for the team to see them than to waste time with Colt McCoy. But, I mean, this has the sort of Houston Texans of the last 2 years potential where, you know, a player like Brandon Cooks, for example, would still get shut down. It's very, very bleak. You've been talking all offseason about their implied win total and how historically bad it is. And as soon as they started talking about potentially not going with Colt McCoy, I started to see that as a possibility. Once they released him, they're like, I mean, this team has 0-17 written all over it.
4.5 was the win total. It's been getting bet to the under so heavily that I think it's moved down to 3.5, if I'm not mistaken, where, I mean, if you wanted to take the under at 4.5, you have to pay some pretty steep odds on that. And I mean, at a point this offseason, there have definitely been points where I've been wondering if the over on that made sense because it's such a low number. And it's like, win 5 games out of 17? How come you just got to go 5-12? I mean, Kyler could be back at some point. You know, what if he plays 10 games? Even if they lose their first 7 and he plays the last 10, all he's got to do is go 5-5 and you're good at. But I don't know, man. I think I'd take the under 3.5 at this point.
Well, some of the other reporting there too, which I don't know if this is people just, I don't want to say making stuff up, but things that, you know, are just people talking, and it doesn't have that much to do with anything. But some of the reporting when they made the trade and brought in an outside quarterback was that Arizona insiders are telling people that Kyler Murray is more likely than not to not play, which again is something that you have been saying is within the range of possibilities. I mean, they definitely look like they're going down that path, which just takes Marquise Brown, Rondell Moore, someone like a Michael Wilson, sadly, someone like a Trey McBride. It makes it really hard to see a path for them. On the other hand, I would say that I think this wide receiver group is so weak that Trey McBride is still an interesting volume-based play at the very end of your drafts.
Yeah, they have another team that was very thin as well, numbers-wise at receiver. I think they're down to 5. Looks like they're going to be running plenty of 2 tight end stuff. Zach Ertz is saying he's not a lock. I mean, he himself has said he's not a lock for week 1. McBride's probably going to be the starter. They're going to be doing these 2 tight end sets. He's going to be running plenty of routes, I think. I'm with you. I've come around on that. As late as he goes, he's an intriguing name to consider. Maybe he can pick up a lot of volume even in a really bad situation. Sort of like the Rams were, a total meltdown last year, but Tyler Higbee was one of 4 tight ends who had over 100 targets. Bad efficiency, but he still finished as like tight end 6 in PPR on reception volume basically alone. So that would be sort of the upside case for Trey McBride, as it were, that he could be really poor efficiency wise, and the team could really suck, but he could get so many targets that it could work. Sean, we are almost back on the clock. Tajay Spears does go while we are gone. Jonathan Mingo just went off. Roshan Johnson, Chuba Hubbard, Kendre Miller just went.
That's a dagger. I was sure he was going to come back with the supposed hamstring injury today.
At this point, I start to get into, in the way that I updated my rankings, and I'm not confident in this, but I start to get into some of the Colts guys like Evan Hull, Ty Chandler, Clyde Edwards-Helaire sighting in my rankings coming up pretty quick. What kind of names are you looking at here? Oh, you have Jared Goff. That's right. We have Amon-Ra and Jameson Williams now. I'm very comfortable pulling the trigger there and having both Goff and Tua as our QBs.
And there are other QBs still there to where, I mean, I guess I would kind of not expect him to go, but we don't have, I mean, the board got really flat after the middle of the 13 there to where, I mean, there's nobody. I mean, you could take an Irv Smith, you could take a Hunter Henry. I don't think a Hunter Henry pick is a bad pick here. I was checking to see where he has gone the last couple of days.
But Mayer's still there. I think there's a few options on the way back at tight end.
So you want to make sure we just
went. Let's take Goff.
Okay.
So we do have the Tua Goff combo. I do like that. And I like you said, the Thursday night game, we get the week 1 look, right? We have a deep roster now, so it'll be nice that we get Goff and Amon-Ra. If for some reason all that goes poorly for them in week 1, we will not have to play those guys. But if Goff goes and throws for 4 touchdowns, then we'll play him in week 1, and we'll still have Tua for the future games. We have Tua stacked with Waddle as well. So, I mean, we're in a good spot.
Yeah. And, I mean, these things can change, literally in an instant. But it does not look like the Chiefs will have Chris Jones for week 1. I mean, that could be a massive shootout.
Yep. That's the way that I'm hearing it, too. Like, he might be out for a little while, actually.
So not necessarily even for this next pick, but some other names I want to throw out to you. Jalen Hyatt, I think, is an interesting deep stash. We talked about, the obstacles that maybe a Rashee Rice is going to face. I think that Justin Ross is still an interesting deep stash. The package stuff did bother me, and yet at the same time, I do think that if those guys are simply better and they're getting very little from MVS again, and you're talking like week 6, week 7, I guess I don't think it's just 15, 16, 17 reality playoffs. I think those guys are just too much better than the starters for Rice and Ross not to be a big part of it by, say week 7, week 8. So again, just for kind of stash purposes a little bit later, some names that I find appealing. That's certainly
a path you could see, especially for Rice. Ross is a tricky one where, I mean, just health permitting, we don't know how far they're going to push him. I think even if he does a lot of really good stuff, the Chiefs just, the last couple regular seasons have not felt like a team that cares that much about the regular season in terms of like pushing their best players out there, I think they would hold him back, and then he would have an awesome playoffs, you know? Shawn, the only tight end that goes is Tyler Conklin. We are back on the clock. I do like the tight end idea, unless you want to go receiver. Did you want to go receiver here? Did you want to go Hyatt? We do have 6 now. I kind of like, we're getting thin at tight end. I kind of like.
So Hyatt is going in 14. I think the better pick there is just, I really think people want Wandale on all of their rosters. And for whatever reason, that has not been something that has been caught on with drafters.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just that I'm completely wrong about it. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Team 5 here, Shawn, does not have a tight end. They're going to start hammering it late, probably here at 14 and 15. I don't know that any of these guys are going to make it back to us at tight end. Do you like Henry the most? You have him at the top, or do you like Mayer?
Well, Mayer probably has a better chance. Hunter Henry's going to – let's go Hunter Henry.
Yeah. You know I like him. So, I think he's a good pairing with Pitts as well, just as sort of a stability play.
Yeah, definitely. And I've written in multiple articles, and in some ways I think this one actually does work a little bit for best ball. For best ball, you want both that touchdown upside and you want sort of that stability in your roster where if you have some of the, extremely volatile guys, someone like a Hunter Henry is just massively undervalued. And if this were actually going to be the case, I do think he would have started to get pushed up a little bit. But at this point, it's hard for me to see him as anything other than not the tight end leader, but the overall leader in fantasy scoring from that receiving group overall.
Yeah.
Which it makes it very hard not to pick in round 14 in tight end premium.
Another note from my write-up, as you mentioned, I did a full team-by-team write-up on stealing signals. Looking at the cut down to 53-man rosters and really trying to highlight things that might go overlooked a little bit in the ways that teams cut down. The Patriots very famously cut down to 1 quarterback. They also cut down to only 2 tight ends, Henry and Gesicki. Also only 2 running backs, Ramondre and Zeke. They did that to carry some extra offensive linemen. They're obviously not going to only hold 2 running backs and only hold 2 tight ends all year. They did actually claim Matt Corral, who might end up being their backup all year. They held, I think, some extra defenders as well with this extra roster space. But the point is, they are currently right now, as we're recording this, only expected to have Hunter Henry and Mike Gesicki out there. And if everything we hear about Mike Gesicki not being able to play inline and not being able to block and basically being this big receiver is true, then Hunter Henry has to play every single snap, is what it comes down to.
He's got to play quite a bit. So you had mentioned Evan Hull. He's a name that I like. He's one I also struggle with because I think that the situation there with the Colts is getting so bleak. And I do know where I feel comfortable drafting him. Go ahead.
I agree with that. But one thing I wrote about with them today, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is like almost certainly whichever Colts back plays the most snaps in week 1 is going to lead waiver. I mean, not necessarily lead waiver wire columns, but it's going to be heavily discussed in waiver wire columns after week 1.
One of the things that so he's going to jump into the 0 RB list in the update, which depending on when this show releases, will hopefully be out for listeners. But I did have some positive notes for Zach Moss there because I think that he actually gets sort of overly beaten down despite having some pluses in the metrics that for other backs people fall all over. I mean, you think about, and this isn't to say that David Montgomery's not a good player or shouldn't be going relatively early, but I mean, David Montgomery went in the middle of the 6th round. I mean, he and Zach Moss actually have quite a bit of similarity. So if you need a player, then I think Zach Moss possibly gets in there. I think this is possibly a very, mixed backfield where the offense is bad and then they rotate guys to where you don't get anything out of it. But Evan Hull is the sort of fun player. Although again, I mean, he really has kind of that profile that is like very interesting without quite being good enough in any particular area. He's got the try hard element, which I mean, we really like. And yet at the same time, maybe isn't the one that really gets it done for you. So I guess the contrast for me is that I think that Sean Tucker is an absolutely must draft on every single team. And, I don't want to draft him earlier than I need to, and yet I also don't want to miss on him. Where's your thought on him as it relates to how we should be prioritizing these running backs and who to take first, and if that's the position we need, and how we do this in the next couple of rounds?
You had a whole lot of interesting thoughts there, and then you very definitively said that you think one of those players is a must draft on every single team. So for me, the priority would be the guy that the 0RB guys said is a must draft on every team. Immediately in my head, I went, man, I almost took him in the last round of my Mastiff. Why have I not got more Sean Tucker so far? I mean, I think that's the priority at this point, Sean. The listeners did the same thing. They went, crap, why don't I have more Sean Tucker?
Well, I mean, they'll probably be like after week 1, like, thank goodness we didn't listen to that. The other interesting note,
I just moved Sean Tucker ahead of Clyde Edwards-Helaire in my rankings while we're talking.
I am confident he's better than Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Whether that translates will be another question. Kenny Pickett did go. And we got 2 pretty good QBs. I guess I'm still sort of attached to this idea of taking more quarterbacks. So if certain guys fall, I like the 3 QBs still. But we are up. Jalen Hyatt came back, which we weren't necessarily expecting. Michael Mayer is a target for us. We want both Sean Tucker and Evan Hall. I mean, this is exciting because when you're around 15 and you got a lot of guys you like, I mean, that's when a main event gets really fun.
I don't know where to go. Honestly, I didn't expect all those guys to come back. I guess I'm not super high on Hyatt, but we have 6 receivers and one of them suspended for 6 weeks. And honestly, might not even play much when he gets back, the way his team talked about him all offseason. Jameson Williams is not a guy to bank on to be So, I mean, maybe it's Hyatt, but with our 4 running backs, maybe a 5th makes sense. I would also be totally fine with the 3rd tight end. It seems like we have Tucker's the guy that let's just take Tucker.
Okay. So we'll do that. And that gives us, I think. So
that's the guy we don't want to lose.
Right. And I don't mean that for that to close us off to Evan Hall either, because as you mentioned, you'd hate to pass him here at a great price and then bid 300 for him after week 1. But we are probably at a point where we don't necessarily need another running back now. So if we don't get one, I think we're okay.
I don't think we need to make that bet. Interestingly, Deion Jackson went in the 12th round in this draft. Zach Moss goes here in the 15th, right after we take Tucker. Hull's going to be the last of the 3 that goes. I do think he's the least likely to lead the team in snaps in week 1, that Moss and Deion Jackson are pretty clearly ahead of them, but that Hull is the one that sort of, if he did lead in snaps in week 1, you'd get the most excited about and be like, okay, well, now we kind of do have to bid on this guy. But we have too many options here, I think, right now to make that bet. Tucker's another one that could just play a lot in week 1, as you noted, and you just said we have to take him in every single draft. So I'm glad we got him instead.
Well, I was about to say, do you think that Deuce Vaughn is a similar play? Obviously, it's not. You have Tony Pollard ensconced there as the star. That offense, though, is going to be much more effective, and their backup group is really weak. It's probably the weakest group of, and if you take the Colts out and all the things that they've done, it's probably the weakest depth chart behind the starter, which is one of the reasons that Tony Pollard has gotten so expensive and so trendy. Is he somebody we would consider, not here, but as we're finishing the team out?
Maybe.
I think as we get back to this pick, I agree with you on Jalen Hyatt. I prefer to have Wandale, who we can probably get even cheaper. I'm kind of thinking Michael Mayer here. But what are your thoughts on Deuce Vaughn?
I think I have a hard time envisioning him actually getting enough work that even if Pollard went down, that they would keep him as a change of pace and specific package guy and use a Rico Dowdle a lot more. I even wrote up in the 53-man cutdown thing that you could probably leave a candle on for Ronald Jones for the reasons you just said, that it's a really poor backup situation. Sam Howell goes here, so that kind of takes our favorite potential option to go to a 3 QB build off the board as well. I think Mayer or Hyatt is probably my preferred. Wandale's still there. Let's push receiver and see if we can get Wandale on the way back, or Justin Ross, or Hyatt. You have all of them in the queue. I think they're all interesting plays. I think let's just take our tight end.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's probably still a case of more likely than not that Michael Mayer does nothing, but his ADP doesn't remotely price in the upside that he has. And I mean, I'm very intrigued by Luke Musgrave. I think that whole deal is going to be very interesting. It certainly looks right now like Jordan Love is set to get out there and actually play pretty well in his first real chance to be the starter. And I mean, they don't have a ton of competition there, but from a more global perspective, and Michael Mayer was an elite prospect and also a priority pick by the Raiders. There are just a lot of guys who go ahead of him in these drafts. And I think about someone like a Jake Ferguson too, where, you know, Taysom Hill goes in the 14th in this. Any of the non-stars at tight end, they're probably not actually going to do much for you. But that's, I think, all the more reason to try and get somebody who could be really, really good.
Yeah, I love the way our tight end room came together, even though we passed on Laporta for Bateman. I think I'm content with that decision as well. As much as I like Laporta, I've been taking a lot of him. Pitts, Hunter Henry, Michael Mayer, pretty interesting tight end room. We get Sean Tucker as the running back 5, a guy you said needs to be drafted in every draft. Got him behind Ramondre Stevenson, Breece Hall, James Cook, and DeAndre Swift. That makes for a really nice 5 at running back. Our receivers, Amon-Ra, St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Traylon Burks, Quentin Johnston, Rashad Bateman, and then Jameson Williams. We talked about how he makes a lot of sense as the wide receiver 6 on this build in particular, where we don't really need to start him early. Even if we have some issues at receiver, we have a lot of running back firepower to help fill the flex. So technically would only really need to start 2 receivers, even in a worst case scenario. I mean, you could have a lot of issues at running back and receiver. Obviously, we are built to withstand some of that, but it can get really bad, and hopefully it doesn't. Our other teams have been, the Jonathan Taylor stuff and things have happened, so you never know. But you like how that receiver room fits together with this team as well. And then Tua and Goff as our 2 quarterbacks. It's not the most exciting quarterback room ever, but they are stacked with our top 2 receivers and Amon-Ra and Waddle. It's 2 offenses you want to have pieces of. I actually think Tua is one of the more exciting quarterbacks. Jameson adds to that Goff situation where it's sort of a double stack. If you have an Amon-Ra great season and then he misses time late and Jameson, kind of needs to come on for them, they're in a playoff hunt, you might be looking at a Goff Jameson, starting situation in the shootout as, a scenario where Amon-Ra was still a very helpful piece to get you to the shootout and get you there. But, things happen sometimes. Guys do a lot to get you a long way into the season, but then maybe don't. I mean, one of the interesting things with FFPC, you have the 11-week regular season, and you have or 12-week, and then you have weeks 13 and 14 are your league playoffs. And so if you clinch after the 12 weeks, which 2 teams do, you then have 2 games where you're trying to win your league playoffs, but you already clinched to the shootout for weeks 15 to 17. So in a lot of ways, in weeks 13 and 14, you're just like, nobody get hurt, right? You just want everyone to stay healthy for 15 to 17. But it can happen. Guys can go down in that stretch. There's that gap there. Sean, all of Hyatt, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Justin Ross went. So I lied to you. I said one of them would come back. They didn't, and they didn't even get close. We're still 5 picks away.
It's too bad that that we're in a draft where Wan'Dale went. I mean, I do now have an absurd amount of Wan'Dale, and so maybe not having him on one team makes some sense. But again, in a redraft environment specifically, there is no downside to rostering someone like Wan'Dale Robinson for the first 2 or 3 weeks, because the upside by the time you need to start him is so immense. Evan Hull has come back, though. We're 3 picks away there. Trey McBride, Deuce Vaughn. Another name that, maybe we talk about after the picks come through here, but I remain a fan of and intrigued by the fact that the Rams didn't cut Zach Evans. And as long as they haven't cut him, it feels like there's a shot there.
But they kept 4 running backs. They kept Ronnie Rivers as well. It's not like they went
Right. They didn't show clear preference for him by any stretch.
Yeah, true.
But once they kept those other guys, I thought that maybe, again, he would get cut, but he did not.
I don't even know what to do here, Sean. So we get all the way back to our pick. Evan Hull still there. Trey McBride came all the way back around as a potential fourth tight end to get a look at him in week 1. And then, yeah, like you mentioned, several other running backs. You put Chris Evans into the queue as well. Curtis Samuel is a wide receiver that we talk about sometimes. Probably better for best ball than a play here. Not really a viable upside swing as your wide receiver 7 necessarily. What's your preference here?
This is maybe going to sound weird, but I almost want to just take Trey McBride as a blocking move because he's just not someone you want to let a different team have.
Let's do it. I think we're in, like, I was almost going to start talking about kickers and defenses, but there's actually been 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 Ds off the board, and Justin Tucker's gone, which is the only kicker that I would even really care to take at this point. And we're at 1709. We still have the 18th, 19th, and 20th. It is a draft where a lot of these guys have gone early, which is part of why a lot of our targets have continued to linger here into these rounds.
Yeah, I wouldn't be against. It's kind of funny because since we at least have a tiny little preference for maybe streaming the defense anyway, Butker, especially if you can do some weird stuff after that first Thursday night game, and then Evan McPherson, those guys I think are extremely appealing, more so than defenses are.
I agree. And Evan Holt did go on the turn after we took McBride. So all the Colts backs are gone. I mean, if you want to take Deuce Vaughn, I'm okay with that. You were just kind of asking what my thoughts were. I'm curious. Do you think that he has paths to actual workload? I guess I think that he's going to be like a kind of gimmicky player. He's very small, and I know Rico Dowdle is not good in a lot of those things, but like he has size, and I think they're gonna. I mean, especially Mike McCarthy is such an old school football guy. I think they're going to be like, this is his role. I think Vaughn's going to get a couple of interesting touches a game early, but that Dowdle's probably going to be the more clear number 2 and actually get used a little bit in some short yardage stuff and some banger situations. And then if something were to happen to Pollard, that his role would expand more, or Ronald Jones would actually potentially factor in before Vaughn would get anything more than like 8 touches. But maybe I'm just not being creative enough.
No, I think those are big concerns. And it's one of the reasons why I basically have 0 of him and haven't really, I think, given him in some ways the credit that he deserves. Blair Andrews loves him, and in part because he's just really good.
Yeah.
And so at a certain point, I mean, you can be so good that it does mitigate some of the size issues. And I don't think that the rest of their guys, you can really apply that modifier to. So I think he's interesting from that perspective. He
had some incredible production numbers in college, right?
Yeah.
If you want to take him, we can definitely take him, or we can go Butker. I think those are our options here in 18.
Yeah, I think it's pretty, for me, it's pretty clear Butker if you're good with that.
Yeah, let's do it. We might even get Vaughn back. He's a guy that sometimes goes, but sometimes doesn't even go at all. So we'll see what happens there. And so we're going to speed ahead here for a second. After the Harrison Butker pick, I had to step away for a quick moment. Sean finished our last 2 picks. Our draft is over in real time. Deuce Vaughn actually went 1 pick after Harrison Butker, so he did not make it back. Sean went with the 3 QB strategy, took Desmond Ridder in the 19th, grabbed Minnesota's defense in the 20th. So the final roster was Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Ramondre Stevenson, Breece Hall, Kyle Pitts, James Cook, DeAndre Swift. So 5 straight picks from round 3 to round 7 that were non-receivers after the receivers start. And then 3 more receivers, Traylon Burks, Quentin Johnston, and Rashad Bateman, Tua Tagovailoa in the 11th, and then Jameson Williams in the 12th. So after that 5-round stretch with no receivers, we went receivers in 4 of the next 5. And then Jared Goff, Hunter Henry, Sean Tucker, Michael Mayer, Trey McBride, several receivers late, Harrison Butker, Desmond Ridder, and the mini defense. So we end up with 3 quarterbacks. We end up with 4 tight ends, only 5 running backs, and only 6 receivers in the end. But we took nothing but running backs and receivers with the exception of Kyle Pitts through the first 10 rounds and really loaded up early. That's what the goal was with these types of teams that we talked about potentially hitting a lot of the running back value. We get Ramondre, Breece, James Cook, and Swift. We've talked through this on recent episodes, Sean. And I think we executed it really well here.
I love how this team looks. Kind of at the end there, you were gone. You can't trust me not to take that third quarterback when I am left alone to my own devices. I was looking at it there. As you mentioned, Deuce Vaughn went 1 pick after we selected Harrison Butker. And then Chris Evans did go 3 picks before it got back to us. So the 2 names I was actually looking at and decided not to pull the trigger on it for us there were DJ Chark, who I still actually like to be the leading receiver for the Panthers. And so you say, well, you probably should have drafted him in round 19 then. You had made a good pitch for Jonathan Mingo. I think that is interesting. I think I might be like too far down on Mingo because, I mean, one of the things that there are going to be different viewpoints on this, but when someone has a profile like Mingo's where, and I think you could say similar things for Rashee Rice, where it really is reliant on athleticism and final year production, then when you go watch the highlights and the player does not pop in his like best plays of his collegiate career, that does worry me a little bit. Now, you mentioned that Bryce Young has done some positive things. I was going to be very open to taking him in that next round as we came back, but he actually did go 2 spots ahead of Jared Goff. So anybody who was wondering kind of where that portion of the discussion disappeared to, it was because he didn't get back to us. So Chark was there. I did pass on him. The other one was Curtis Samuel and passed on him. One of the things with Ritter, and there's a pretty good argument that this actually doesn't come into play much at all when you are really trying to maximize your own roster. The other 11 teams don't matter as much. I certainly would never recommend that you make a pick like in the single digit rounds just to mess with somebody else. I mean, you're trying to maximize your roster. But given what I see as really high upside for both Trey McBride and Desmond Ritter, along with absolutely no floor, I think it makes sense to stash those guys if you don't have another player that you really want. And in neither of those cases did we have it. The other thing with Ritter, as I was thinking about it, is we do have Kyle Pitts. And so, quarterbacks get hurt along with other positions. They certainly got hurt a lot in 2022. One of the things that we ran into in our main events and our general FFPC drafts that was very frustrating is that we had Trey Lance go down at the beginning of the game, which cost us potential for those points, but then also, wreaked some havoc with our QB depth charts. This gives another guy we can look at. And if Pitts hits, I do actually like Ritter to hit. We probably won't end up keeping those 3 guys since we did get Tua, and we think that he's got a very high upside. But that was kind of the consideration there at the end of the draft. And then just, a tiny little note that probably no one cares about. I was hoping the Jaguars would get back to us because they face Anthony Richardson and the suddenly Jonathan Taylor-less Colts in week 1. They did not. So we take the Minnesota Vikings defense in round 20. They get to face Baker Mayfield, who we know likes to throw a lot of passes into the offensive line. Maybe you get a tipped pick 6. Certainly we don't expect the Buccaneers to be good on offense, but I also think they'll be aggressive trailing. They're not just going to give up. Garbage time could be kind of interesting in those games from a defensive perspective. So that was kind of the final thoughts there. But this is a very unique team for us, but I love it.
Yeah, I think all the extra tight ends, QBs, you mentioned the targets not being there. It was an interesting draft late when, Wandale went and Jalen Hyatt went and Justin Ross went in the stretch from the 16th to the 17th where we talked about maybe one of them would come back. And so we went with another tight end at that decision point. You talked about the running backs that didn't make it back here towards the end and taking Ritter. Some of the names that didn't even get drafted that we weren't really considering clear targets. I mean, Jeff Wilson just lands on IR, so he comes off the board. That's part of what pushed some of the other interesting names up higher. DJ Chark, you mentioned, is one. Oh, he did go in this draft. I'm still seeing.
He went 2 picks later. Yeah.
Got it. Oh, my queue didn't update because I stepped away. So, at any rate, a couple of the other names I was going to mention did go very late as well. Gus Edwards, Tank Dell, some guys that you do see go. They did go at the very end. Curtis Samuel never did go. There are a couple guys still in this room that you typically see come off the board that didn't, but they weren't necessarily fits for our roster. And then the ones that were kind of the upside swings, this room went for them. And so, yeah, you'll find yourself in those rooms. Even Justice Hill, Sean, goes in the 18th round. He might be a threat to Gus Edwards. I kind of like that decision to take him over Edwards. Some people have been on Edwards this offseason. I haven't been as excited about that. But Hill looked great this preseason. Somebody, obviously, that you have been a big fan of in the past.
I love him. It's never helped at all, but I love him.
Yeah, he's still a fun guy to watch. He had a great preseason. But yeah, no, I agree with you, Sean. I mean, one of the things I love about this team, if I can just have a moment, is the symmetry through 9 rounds. If you look at it on a board, it goes wide receiver, running back. We get the tight end in the middle, and then running back, wide receiver on the other side. It's a perfect little palindrome in the first 9 rounds. But it is sort of what we have talked about structurally, is to hit the receivers early and to go into the other picks in the dead zone and then go back to the receiver depth, and being able to get Traylon Burks, Quentin Johnston, and Rashad Bateman at 10:04 was a really key part of this build. I feel a lot better about this team because of those 3 picks and because of the 5 wide receivers we have. It justified the DeAndre Swift pick in the 7th round. It allows this whole thing to kind of come together. There is a part of the Sean, if you look at, what might we have done different, this or that, there is a part of it that you can go back to the James Cook pick in the 6th. I mean, knowing now that, JSN and Pickens and Judy were all going to go before they came to the 7th, and we were going to want DeAndre Swift in the 7th, maybe you say, hey, yeah, it would have been nice to just take James Cook there, or Jackson Smith and Jigba over James Cook there in the 6th. But then also, the flip side of that, knowing what we know about getting Burks, Quentin Johnson, and Bateman, I don't think I actually agree with that. I really like the way that we get all 4 of these receivers and still get to 4 running backs and 5 really strong receivers.
It's interesting too, because you can run into the trap of developing an idea early on and then kind of relying on that idea too much as the entire draft season develops. And certainly if parts of the thesis are removed, you want to be willing to get off of that. One of the things that has been interesting recently is that the Sam Howell play, people are starting to embrace. I don't think that much has changed for me, other than the worst case scenario, I'm not winning the starting job, is now out. But there are still, there's a very wide range there. But that's kind of all set up to say that the most exploitable way to play the 2023 season for me has always been through Jalen Waddle and Tua Tagovailoa. Now, this could very easily be a famous last words kind of statement where, they play the first month and are fine, but don't separate you in any way, shape, or form. But when you look at what Tua did when he was healthy last season, the difference between what he does and what Joe Burrow, who goes at the end of round 4, and Justin Herbert, who goes, middle of round 5, certainly Trevor Lawrence, middle of round 7. And it's not to say that just what those guys did last year is the only relevant point, but the scoring ranges that you have for those 3 players who are more expensive is just going to be very, very similar to the scoring range that you get from a healthy Tua. And so from that perspective, having him there, and we had talked about we wanted Marvin Mims or maybe even Rashee Rice, even though that's more controversial now, perhaps. But both of those guys were gone. And we picked him instead of A-Chain and Spears, Kendre Miller. Those 3 backs, I think, are interesting picks who come off after him. But you're basically looking at this draft and saying everyone who comes off after Tua is almost a lottery ticket type of play. And one of the things that JJ and I talked about on his show a little bit is just how overly confident we are in double-digit picks and how they tend to not actually contribute. And it's not to say that you shouldn't be very intentional with those selections. And I think that that's one of the kind of fun things about what we did do in the double-digit rounds. But you've got to be realistic about what the expected value is from those picks. In that context, when you can take Tua after every player that you think is a meaningful pick in your draft, and other drafters, I mean, he's the QB 12. Everybody else has addressed their QB position before that. If my thesis comes to fruition, and it's not guaranteed to, but I think that again, the evidence for it is pretty strong, that's a huge competitive advantage. And so I like that, especially with being able to get Jared Goff to go with it and giving you that other shot where either of those two guys could break out. I mean, Goff has a profile that, again, as you mentioned quite frequently, is heavily predicated on just putting up huge passing numbers. But this offense is set up to do that from time to time. So you've got a matchup-based play as well as a breakout-based play. I really like the elite QBs. It's just kind of like the zero RB element back, before the, this year, maybe before last year, where people are like, oh, you must not like running backs. Like, no, I mean, Jamal Charles and those guys you absolutely love, but there are structural reasons why you kind of need to go in a different direction. I love the star QBs. I mean, I love Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, but I just think that the board and the overall way that scoring works, when you're trying to be humble about your roster and giving yourself enough depth to be competitive all season long. And it's not just people getting hurt either. You're going to have some guys underperform and some guys outperform. You want to get to weeks 15 through 17. And the guys that you were starting, those 6 players in the 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, and the 2 flex, those guys are absolutely on fire, right? They're not just guys who can score. I mean, you want them to be 6 legitimate stars at that point. If you just draft 6, I mean, your chances of having the right group is very limited.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the ways that the points add up, I mean, we're not expecting Jared Goff to score with Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Patrick Mahomes, but that's one roster spot. As you're pointing out, we're going to be strong. The idea with this late round quarterback build is to be very strong at those 6 spots, and actually 7 when you bring in the tight end spot as well, the 2 running back spots, the 2 receiver spots, the 2 flex spots, and tight end. And we got Kyle Pitts, and we expect him to be a very important part. At QB, if we're averaging 18 points a game or something like that, and we're going up against 30, Jalen Hurts, we're giving up 12 points. That's a lot of points. That's a bad scenario for us. That means we didn't do very well at QB, and we're facing, elite quarterbacks basically every week. Or, if we're giving up 12 points, say we're scoring 15 and we're going up against 27 or whatever. I mean, you could make it 14, right? But then there's 7 other roster spots that we're talking about trying to win across, and we're trying to win 2 points per spot or something like that. You're not going to win every single other spot, but if you're really strong, I mean, one of those spots, the last flex spot, if you're winning the flex and you have a star in that spot, can gain you those 12 points back alone, right? I mean, that's the idea of the depth and having enough firepower at all the other spots. The point is not for Jared Goff or Tua to be able to match what Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes can do. It's for your roster to outscore another roster. And your whole point there is not taking those quarterbacks high gives us a much stronger ability, coupled with what that other great point you just made about the overconfidence that we're going to be right on a lot of these picks. It's humility-based drafting. We say it year after year on the show to take a lot of players. I mean, we always talk about the zero RB strategy and the really wide receiver heavy builds, and people love to say that's such an arrogant thing, and we're so cocky with our receivers. And truly, it's the opposite. It is us saying we can't just pick the 4 receivers that are going to be great and are going to go into our starting lineup all year. We need to have 6 or 7 of them. We're not going to be right. We're going to have misses. We're going to have busts. We're going to have injuries. And then, we'll take late round running backs or what have you. We're playing things a little bit differently this year, but it has always been that idea of redundancy has always been that, goes hand in hand with that concept of humility-based drafting and the understanding that you can't just expect to get every player right and call that a strategy. That's just not, I mean, if you want to draft hundreds of teams and make a whole bunch of different combinations and just hope you run into something and your player takes are really strong, that's fine. So be it. Go for it. But certainly if you're only drafting a few dozen or less, one team, you want to be able to come up with some type of structure or some type of strategy where you are mitigating the potential risks and understanding that things aren't going to go exactly perfect. You're not going to have the perfect combination of league-winning players. And so that's what we're always talking about on the show. And that's what the strategy this year as well is built and thought through to do. It's to hit the pockets of the different positions at the spots that allow you to put a combination of players together that is the most firepower, the most potential league winners and difference makers and impact pieces, so that when you're wrong about a bunch of these players, you still have enough to fill all those spots and make a difference. And so, yeah, I mean, when I stepped away, Shawn, just for the listeners, you obviously know this, but I had to run to my kid's school for a quick little meet and greet, less than a half hour. I was back no time. But as I was driving over there, I was thinking about the Jared Goff pick. You mentioned him as his ceiling, and I was just like, man, I'm excited to play Jared Goff double stacks with Jameson Williams and Amon-Ra St. Brown in the shootout. I mean, you get there, and the Lions can score 35 a game. And they can have a game where Amon-Ra catches 9 passes and has 110 yards and scores, and Jameson Williams catches 2 long touchdowns in the same game, right? And they're both stars, and Jared Goff throws 3 or 4 touchdowns and 300-plus yards because he throws 50 times because they're in a track meet in the fantasy playoffs. So, yeah, I mean, this is a fun team. We're set up to really maximize the ceiling. You obviously already talked about the Tua and Waddle elements of that. Now we also have a Ritter and Pitts stack built in as I come back from my little meet and greet. I'm excited to find out about. Look, if Pitts hits, Ritter's going to hit. I mean, that's just the deal. I think I love adding Ritter to any Pitts pick because, you know, the Pitts pick comes with a lot of Arthur Smith related, Atlanta Falcons related questions. But if he's a star tight end this year, then that means a lot has gone right for Ritter as a 19th round pick. So I really like that pick as well, Shawn. That could be a real upside pick as well. So fun team overall.
As you were talking about some of these things that can happen with the QBs and the receivers, it reminded me of a fantasy playoff game a little over a decade ago now, where Josh McCown, not the most likely suspect, lit it up to Alshon Jeffrey and turned out to be very meaningful for me. You look at the schedule.
Brandon Marshall and Martellus Bennett. I remember this. Yeah, this is when you won the title. But that was a fun Bears team. It was a concentrated team. He was carrying multiple fantasy relevant pieces.
We've got Miami versus the Jets in Week 15. We're hoping for that to be a shootout. We don't have Garrett Wilson on this squad, but obviously we have lots of places. And then, I mean, if Miami absolutely lights it up that week, it will be tough to go away from them when they play at home the following week against Dallas. But, I mean, you have Detroit at Minnesota. You're in a dome. You're chasing Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson. Then the following week, you're at Dallas chasing CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott. And there's some potential for these guys to put up some points in the fantasy playoffs.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that is incredibly exciting. They're also at home. Week 15, they get the Broncos. Not quite as exciting. But, yeah, I mean, 3 straight dome games for the Lions to close things in the fantasy playoffs. I mean, you almost wish we would have taken Laporta, too, and just had every Lion we could get on this roster.
Yeah, it is fun. Hopefully we have the right guys started in the right games. Hopefully all of this is relevant in the end. I just do want to say, too, we talked a little bit as we were drafting. We ended up getting the tight end 23, 25, 30. I'm pretty skeptical about the tight ends from Dallas Goedert to Hunter Henry at tight end 23. I mean, this is the way it should be. Wherever you like the pockets of value on your board, that's who you should pick. And so you should be happy after a draft that you pick the guys that you have labeled as targets. But I do think there is an exploitable area late in drafts in tight end premium. And so, if you get behind, or in our case, you have one, but you want some depth and there are some potential issues, I would just encourage listeners that unless they have a clear target, and if you have a clear target, go after that guy. If you don't, be aware that there are some players late. You don't have to chase. You don't have to burn tight end picks in this area from, say, round 7 to round 13. Go ahead and feel comfortable using those picks on non-tight ends. You're going to have some options late. You don't want to, I mean, even if it's just one pick, like we say, as you go through those rounds there, you can't afford to throw away a selection that could become something meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, there's just not that much difference between like tight end, I don't know, 10, tight end 12, tight end 14. I don't know really where the number is, but let's just say tight end 14 and like tight end 30. I mean, and genuinely, it's one large group of tight ends. Those guys at the back, we took Hunter Henry, Michael Mayer, Trey McBride. But I mean, Cade Otton, that guy can, like, especially with Russell Gage out now, like he could end up being viable, running a ton of routes on a bad offense, like we were talking about with McBride, but certainly potentially viable. Tyler Conklin went. Gerald Everett goes pretty late. Irv Smith goes late. Dawson Knox is back here. I don't really think he's going to get enough routes. Isaiah Likely goes back here. If something were to happen to Mark Andrews, he's like a perfect tight end handcuff type. There are a lot. I've seen Dulcich go incredibly late now with some of the concerns surrounding his routes. And I think he certainly makes sense at a certain point. In this draft, Shawn, Gesicki didn't even get drafted. We talked about how the Patriots only carried the 2 tight ends. It's possible that Gesicki actually still hits a little bit on his upside scenarios. Logan Thomas doesn't get drafted, so no Washington tight end got drafted. There are several other. Noah Fant didn't get drafted. There are like, I'm not saying that all these guys are going to be great or anything, but it ultimately isn't that much different than some of the plays in the earlier rounds. You know, Dulcich is a great example as one that was going in those rounds. And then as soon as we saw, oh man, he's not actually going to run that many routes, or it seems like that's a scenario, a possibility, he started going in like the 19th in some of the drafts. And I've seen him that late. He goes in the 12th here. So, I mean, he still can sometimes be anchored into that range that he used to go in, but you can see him fall several rounds from there. There's going to be other tight ends that have gone in those ranges that are going to wind up not actually running enough routes to be relevant. It's how the position's played. Not all these guys are going to wind up being good picks, but you can hit it with volume like we did late, even though we took Pitts. I mean, that's like a better way to play tight end, is to take forced shots later than to take one that you're really confident in that is like a Tyler Higbee or something like that in the 9th round.
Exactly. And as I was listening there, I don't know if it comes through on the mic, but my cat is usually a very passive listener to the podcast, not a participant, but she was definitely punctuating some of those points. She agrees with you strongly at tight end. Ben, this was a lot of fun. I can't wait to see. Every time we do a main event draft, it gets me super fired up for the start of the season. It's only a handful of days away now. Hopefully everyone enjoyed this special edition of Stealing Bananas. That's going to do it today, but I did want to mention that I selected a couple of winners in the review contest. It's always a little bit awkward in terms of saying the names or the handles that are there for the reviews, but Chandler and the Achievers were the 2 winners of the drawing. We had such a great response, and there were so many fantastic reviews that for me, just really touching in terms of what people wrote, but I wanted to take it beyond that as well. So I've actually pulled 3 additional names. I'm going to be doing something, it won't be the same thing, but something with those names as well, as I figure out, what is reasonable here with a week to go before the season starts. And kind of as I figure that out, we'll also be naming those. But again, thank you to everyone who participated in that. We're going to do a couple of $350 Fantasy Pros teams and hope to win the $1 million. So everyone who participated again, I thank you so much. It was really cool. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always is Ben Gretch, whom you can follow at @yardspergretch. We referenced his cut down day stealing signals post frequently throughout the show, but it's one of only but it's only one of many fantastic pieces that I've had the pleasure of reading in the last several weeks, and certainly even in the last couple of days. Make sure you get over there, subscribe to Stealing Signals, subscribe to Stealing Signals Gold. Ben will have more info for you on that if you have your interest piqued. But I mean, if you get to get in there and do some YouTube questions with Ben himself, I mean, there's a lot I'd be willing to pay for that one. So make sure you get signed up there. Also, Stealing Lines, the betting project with Dalton Cates. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code is RVRadio2023 at checkout, 10% discount on the 1-year subscription. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.